Women. Most political scientists point to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 as the beginning of the fight for equality. At this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton led the fight for political suffrage and supported a doctrine very similar in nature to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions for Women's Rights stated in part, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women." It listed a series of abuses such as government failing to allow women to vote, the compelling of women to submit to laws in which they had no voice in passing, and the withholding of rights given to other members of society. It took the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 for women to gain the right to vote. From that time until the 1960s, the women's movement was stagnant. The traditional family dominated. The Brandeis Brief, a friend of the court opinion offered by Louis Brandeis in Mueller v. Oregon, 1908, which spoke about inherent differences between men and women in the workplace, was the prevalent viewpoint. Laws protecting women in the workplace were virtually non-existent. Only during World War II, when women were forced to leave their homes for the war effort in the factories, were they recognized as essential labor. A turning point in the battle for equality was the publication of Betty Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique in 1963. The dawn of the age of feminism was born. Groups such as the National Organization of Women, NOW, and the National Women's Political Caucus were formed. They supported a proposed amendment to the Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment. Previously described in Lesson 4, in the section dealing with the amending process, it attempted to do for women what the 14th Amendment eventually did for African Americans. It was ironic that one of the arguments used against its passage was the amendment was not necessary because the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment already existed. One of the earliest acts passed was the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which required employers to pay men and women the same wages for doing the same jobs. However, the issue of comparable worth, paying women equally for jobs similar to those held by men, has not been resolved by the courts or federal government. Women's rights became a reality as a result of many of the acts of Congress and Supreme Court decisions that came about initially to give African Americans their civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had an anti-sex discrimination provision. In 1972, those Title VII provisions were extended by the Education Act of 1972. Title IX of that act made sex discrimination in federally funded education programs illegal. Just prior to that legislation, in 1969, a presidential order directed that equal opportunities for women be considered as a national policy. It took a key court case, Reed v. Reed, 1971, which made a state law that favored men over women in the selection of an estate's executor unconstitutional, to establish a legal precedent. 2 years later, in Frontiero v. Richardson, 1973, the court spoke definitively, stating that there can be no doubt that our nation has had a long and unfortunate history of sex discrimination. A medium scrutiny standard was established in 1976 in Craig v. Boren, when the court ruled that if discrimination was apparent, whether it was aimed at men or women, it would be illegal. The courts have also ruled that certain work-related situations constitute job discrimination. In 1977, in Dothard v. Ralston, the court struck down an Alabama law forbidding women from serving as prison guards in all-male prisons. In 1992, in UAW v. Johnson Controls, the court ruled that Johnson Controls could not prevent women from working in a battery factory, even if the work caused infertility in women. A related issue, sexual discrimination in the workplace, has been raised since the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Since University of Oklahoma law professor Anita Hill raised those charges, the public's awareness of the issue has been on the rise. President Clinton's appointment of Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court in 1994 sent a signal that job discrimination and sexual harassment would not be tolerated. Advances in political office also became a feature of the quest for women's rights. From the victory of Connecticut Governor Elsa Grasso in 1974 to the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman Supreme Court Justice in 1981, to the nomination of Geraldine Ferraro as Walter Mondale's running mate in the 1984 presidential election, women have successfully attained significant public positions. In the 1992 elections, more women were elected to Congress than ever before, including the first African American senator, Carol Moseley Brown. The trend continued in the 2000 election, when more women senators were elected, including Hillary Rodham Clinton, who was elected as a senator from New York. She is the first former First Lady elected to public office.